In the dusty heart of Millbrook, Colorado Territory, where the Arkansas River cuts through red clay and broken dreams, a dead auction was about to unite two shattered souls in ways neither could have imagined. Sarah Coleman stood at the edge of the courthouse square, her black mourning dress a stark contrast against the sun-bleached wood of the platform where desperate men were being sold like livestock to satisfy their creditors. At 26, she carried herself with the rigid composure of someone who had learned that showing weakness invited vultures. But her green eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a woman fighting a losing battle against time and circumstance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Riverside Ranch had been hemorrhaging money since Michael's death 2 years ago, and despite her determination to honor his memory by keeping their dream alive, the reality was as harsh as the Colorado winter wind. Cattle had been disappearing. Fences needed constant repair, and the bank notes were coming due with the relentless persistence of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She had exactly $4.37 in her reticule, money that should have gone toward next month's supplies. But desperation had driven her to town with the wild hope that she might find help at rock-bottom prices. The auctioneer, a portly man named Henderson who dealt in everything from farm equipment to human labor, was working his way through the lots with the enthusiasm of someone who found genuine pleasure in other people's misfortune. Sarah watched as farmers and ranch hands were purchased by men with harder luck stories than their own, each transaction a reminder of how quickly fortune could turn in the unforgiving territories where survival depended on strength, luck, and the occasional mercy of strangers. It was nearly noon when they brought out Lot 12, and the change in atmosphere was immediate and electric. The man who emerged from the courthouse's shadow had to duck to clear the doorframe, his massive frame unfolding like some ancient oak tree that had grown too large for the forest around it. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world and hands that looked capable of gentle precision or devastating force, depending on what the moment required. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and his face bore the weathered lines of someone who had spent years squinting into harsh sunlight and harder truths. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention and held it with the intensity of a physical touch. They were the color of storm clouds gathering over the mountains, gray-blue and filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to echo in the very bones of anyone who looked too long. When his gaze swept across the crowd and briefly met hers, she felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with the way grief calls to grief across crowded spaces. Lot 12, Henderson announced, his voice carrying less confidence than it had all morning. Benjamin Hayes, age 32, experienced with cattle, horses, and ranch work. Starting bid is $8. The silence that followed was heavy with the kind of tension that comes when people are afraid to want something they can't afford. Sarah could see the way potential bidders shifted uncomfortably, drawn to the obvious value of such a strong worker, but deterred by something in his demeanor that suggested he was not a man to be owned easily. "Come now, gentlemen," Henderson tried again, mopping his brow with a handkerchief despite the shade provided by the courthouse awning. "Look at the size of him. Worth $8 just for his back alone." Still, no hands rose. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for someone else to make the first move, to test the waters of what might be a dangerous investment. $6, the auctioneer offered, his voice climbing with desperation. Surely someone can use a strong hand for $6. The man on the platform, Benjamin Hayes, stood with his head slightly tilted, as if listening to something only he could hear. There was dignity in his stillness, a quiet acceptance that spoke of someone who had long ago made peace with circumstances beyond his control. Sarah found herself studying his face, trying to read the story written in the lines around his eyes and the careful way he held his mouth. This was not the face of a broken man, despite being reduced to chattel in a public square. This was someone who carried his integrity like armor, who remained undiminished even when everything else had been stripped away. $4, Henderson called out, his voice now frankly pleading. $4 for Lot 12. The number hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt her hand moving almost of its own accord. There was something about this man, something in the way he stood alone and unbowed, that called to the part of her that recognized the particular loneliness of carrying on when everything worth fighting for seemed lost. "Here," she called out, her voice cutting through the stillness like a bell across water. $4. The crowd turned to stare at her, their faces a mixture of surprise and concern. She heard Ruth Patterson gasp behind her, heard someone whisper about poor Sarah Coleman finally losing her mind to grief and desperation. But she kept her hand raised, her eyes fixed on Benjamin Hayes, who had turned his full attention to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Henderson looked around desperately, hoping for another bid. Any bid that might save him from the embarrassment of selling such an obviously valuable worker for the price of a good meal. $4, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Going once, going twice. He paused, looking around one last time before bringing his gavel down with a sound like gunshot. Sold to Mrs. Coleman for $4. The transaction was completed with the kind of swift efficiency that suggested Henderson wanted the whole affair over as quickly as possible. Sarah approached the platform with $4 clutched in her gloved hand, her heart beating, with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of walking across the courthouse square. Up close, Benjamin Hayes was even more imposing, but there was something in his careful movements as he stepped down from the platform that suggested a man who was acutely aware of his own strength and the effect it might have on others. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Ma'am," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and somehow familiar. His voice was deep and rough, like whiskey aged in oak barrels, but there was a gentleness underneath that made her think of Michael's voice in the early morning hours when he thought she was still sleeping. "Mr. Hayes," she replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "I hope you'll find the work at Riverside Ranch to your liking. It's not much to look at these days, but it's honest work, and I pay what I owe." The words came out more defensively than she had intended, colored by the assumptions she imagined he must be making about a woman desperate enough to buy a man's labor at a dead auction. He studied her face for a moment with those storm-colored eyes, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing far more than she intended to reveal. "I'm sure it will be fine, Mrs. Coleman," he said, and the way he spoke her name sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. There was something in his tone, a warmth that suggested her reputation had preceded her in ways she hadn't expected. The ride back to the ranch passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of her mare's hooves and the creak of wagon wheels on the packed dirt road that led away from Millbrook toward the river valley where her property lay nestled, between rolling hills and stands of cottonwood trees. Benjamin Hayes rode beside her on a horse he had retrieved from the courthouse stable, a bay gelding that seemed as calm and steady as its rider. Sarah found herself stealing glances at her new employee, trying to reconcile his imposing physical presence with the almost courtly way he handled his horse and the careful distance he maintained from her wagon. There was something about him that seemed familiar, though she was certain they had never met. Perhaps it was simply the way grief had shaped his features, carving lines that she recognized from her own mirror. The Riverside Ranch revealed itself gradually as they topped the last hill before the valley, and Sarah felt the familiar mixture of pride and heartbreak that came with seeing the place she and Michael had built together. The main house was modest but well-constructed, built from local stone and timber with a wide porch that faced the river and caught the evening light like a benediction. The barn and outbuildings showed signs of neglect, paint peeling, and boards warped from 2 winters of minimal maintenance, but the bones of the operation were still sound. "It's beautiful," Benjamin said quietly, and there was something in his voice that suggested he meant more than just the scenic value of the location. "Your husband built this place?" The question was asked with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that mentions of the dead required delicate handling. "We built it together," Sarah replied, then immediately regretted the defensive edge in her voice. "Michael had the vision, but I handled the practical details. He was always better with dreams than with budgets." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, a moment of honesty that revealed more about their marriage than she had intended to share with a stranger. Benjamin nodded as if this information fit with something he already knew, which struck her as odd but not alarming. Perhaps Michael's reputation as a dreamer had been more widespread than she had realized. Dreams are important, he said simply. But someone has to make sure the dreamers eat while they're busy changing the world. The comment was so perfectly apt, so precisely what she had often thought during Michael's more ambitious flights. A fancy that she found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. Exactly, she said, and was surprised by how good it felt to have someone understand the particular challenge of loving someone whose head was permanently fixed on distant horizons. She showed him around the property with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had learned to see problems before they became crises. The cattle were scattered across the north pasture, maybe 40 head where there should have been 60, the missing animals either dead, stolen, or simply wandered off through gaps in fencing that she couldn't afford to repair properly. The barn needed new shingles, several fence posts were rotting at the base, and the windmill that pumped water from the river needed attention that required more height and strength than she possessed. Benjamin examined each problem with the careful attention of someone who understood that small issues became large ones if left unattended, asking questions that revealed both practical knowledge and genuine interest in finding solutions. When they reached the small cemetery plot where Michael's headstone stood surrounded by wild roses that had grown untended since his burial, Benjamin removed his hat and stood in respectful silence. He was a good man, Sarah said, feeling the need to fill the quiet with something that honored Michael's memory. Everyone in Millbrook respected him. He had plans for this place, ideas about how to make it profitable and sustainable. If he had lived, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that had haunted her for 2 years. Some men leave their mark on the world through what they build, Benjamin said quietly, his eyes fixed on the simple stone marker. Others leave it through the people who love them enough to keep building after they're gone. The words were spoken with such gentle certainty that Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since the funeral. I don't know if I'm strong enough, she admitted, the confession torn from her like a splinter being pulled from a wound. Some days it feels like I'm just postponing the inevitable, like I'm fighting a battle that was lost before it began. Benjamin turned to look at her then, and in his storm gray eyes, she saw something that might have been understanding mixed with a determination that seemed almost fierce in its intensity. Strength isn't about never falling down, he said. It's about getting back up every time, even when you can't see a reason to keep fighting. The practical arrangements were settled with the same straightforward efficiency that had marked their earlier interactions. The small bunkhouse behind the barn had been empty since Michael's death, but it was clean and weathertight, with a stove for warmth and cooking. Sarah provided blankets and basic supplies, trying not to notice the way Benjamin's few possessions seemed to speak of a man who had grown accustomed to traveling light and leaving little trace of his passage. Dinner was a simple affair, beef stew and cornbread shared at the kitchen table while the last light faded from the western sky, and the sound of the river provided a constant, soothing backdrop to their conversation. Benjamin proved to be a thoughtful companion, asking about the ranch's history and challenges with the genuine interest of someone who intended to be part of the solution rather than merely collecting wages for time served. The cattle that have gone missing, he said as Sarah served coffee from the pot that had been Michael's pride. Do you think they're being stolen or just wandering off through damaged fencing? The question was asked with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, but Sarah caught the underlying seriousness that suggested he had thoughts on the matter. I've found evidence of both, she admitted, settling into her chair with the weariness of someone who had spent too many nights lying awake worrying about problems with no clear solutions. There are tracks near the south boundary that don't belong to my animals or any of the neighboring herds. But there are also gaps in the fence line that a determined cow could push through without much effort. Benjamin nodded thoughtfully, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup in a way that suggested he was thinking through possibilities and probabilities. I'd like to ride the boundaries tomorrow, get a sense of where we're most vulnerable. Sometimes, the best way to solve multiple problems is to start with the one that's easiest to fix. The simple pragmatism of the approach appealed to Sarah in ways she hadn't expected. Michael had always attacked problems with grand gestures and elaborate plans, approaching each challenge as if it were a puzzle to be solved through sheer force of intellectual will. Benjamin's methodology was different, more like building a wall one stone at a time, until suddenly you looked up and realized you had created something substantial and enduring. That sounds like a reasonable plan, she said, then hesitated before adding, Mr. Hayes, I want you to know that I don't expect you to work miracles. This place has been sliding downhill for 2 years, and $4 doesn't buy enough labor to reverse all of that damage overnight. $4, he repeated, and there was something in his tone that she couldn't quite interpret. Mrs. Coleman, I think you'll find that some things are worth more than their purchase price suggests. The comment seemed to carry layers of meaning that she didn't understand. But before she could ask for clarification, he was rising from the table and thanking her for the meal with the formal courtesy that seemed to be his natural manner. As Sarah cleaned up the dinner dishes and prepared for another night of restless sleep punctuated by worries about cattle and creditors, she found herself thinking about Benjamin Hayes and the way he had looked at Michael's grave with such genuine respect. There had been something almost familiar in his grief, as if he understood the particular weight of mourning someone whose dreams had been cut short by circumstance and cruel timing. From her bedroom window, she could see the warm glow of lamplight in the bunkhouse and the shadow of her new employee moving about as he settled in for his first night at Riverside Ranch. For the first time since Michael's death, the property didn't feel quite so empty, didn't echo quite so hollow with the ghosts of conversations that would never be finished and plans that would never be realized. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as it always did. But tonight there was something different in the air, a sense of possibility that she had almost forgotten how to recognize. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah Coleman allowed herself to hope that perhaps $4 had bought her something more valuable than just a strong back and willing hands. Perhaps it had bought her the beginning of something that might, with patience and care, grow into the kind of partnership that could honor the past while building toward a future worth fighting for. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley floor when Sarah emerged from the house to find Benjamin already at work, his massive frame bent over the broken gate that had been hanging askew for months. The sight of him there, sleeves rolled up and moving with the confident efficiency of someone who understood both wood and metal, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee steaming in her hands. He had found the tools without asking, somehow locating Michael's workshop in the barn and selecting exactly what he needed to repair hinges that had defeated her efforts for the better part of a year. The gate swung smooth and true under his testing, and she could see the satisfaction in his posture as he stepped back to examine his work. "You're an early riser," she called out, approaching with a second cup of coffee that she had prepared without quite knowing why. The gesture felt natural, the kind of hospitality that came from years of shared morning routines, even though they were still essentially strangers. "Old habits," Benjamin replied, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks that seemed to carry more weight than such a simple gesture warranted. "My father always said that a man who waits for the sun to wake him has already lost half his day." There was something in the way he spoke of his father that suggested complicated feelings, respect mixed with something that might have been regret. Sarah found herself studying his profile as he tested the gate's movement one final time, noting the careful precision of his movements and the way morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair. Up close, she could see small scars on his hands and forearms, the kind that came from years of working with unpredictable animals and unforgiving materials. These were not the soft hands of someone who had lived an easy life. "The cattle," she said, gesturing toward the north pasture where her remaining herd grazed in the early morning mist. "You mentioned wanting to check the boundaries. I could show you the areas where I've found the most damage." The offer came out more eager than she had intended, colored by a loneliness she hadn't realized had grown so acute until presented with the prospect of companionship in work that had become solitary drudgery. Benjamin nodded, his attention shifting to the scattered dots of cattle visible in the distance. "That would be helpful. Sometimes fresh eyes can spot things that become invisible when you see them every day." The comment was made without condescension, acknowledging her experience, while offering his own perspective as a compliment rather than a replacement. They saddled horses in the barn, Sarah's mare and the bay gelding that Benjamin handled with the unconscious skill of someone who had spent a lifetime around horses. She noticed the way the animals responded to him, calming under his touch with the kind of immediate trust that couldn't be faked or forced. Even her mare, who had been skittish and difficult since Michael's death, seemed to settle in his presence. The ride to the south boundary took them through terrain that told the story of the ranch's gradual decline in ways that were painful for Sarah to acknowledge. Fence posts leaned at angles that spoke of winter wind and summer heat working against. Wood that should have been replaced seasons ago. Wire hung slack in places, creating gaps that an enterprising cow could navigate without much effort. "This section has given me the most trouble," Sarah explained as they approached a stretch where the fence disappeared entirely into a tangle of fallen cottonwood branches and accumulated debris. "Every time I think I have it secured, something else gives way. It's like trying to hold back the river with my bare hands." Benjamin dismounted and walked the fence line with the methodical attention of someone conducting a professional survey. He examined post foundations, tested wire tension, and studied the ground for signs of animal traffic with an expertise that suggested extensive experience with range management. When he knelt to examine tracks in the soft earth near a watering hole, his expression grew thoughtful in a way that made Sarah's stomach tighten with apprehension. "These aren't from your cattle," he said finally, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone stating an unpleasant fact. "Too narrow, too uniform. These are from driven animals, probably moved through here at night when the sound would carry less." He stood and brushed dirt from his hands, his gray eyes meeting hers with an expression that mixed sympathy with determination. "You're certain they're being stolen?" The question came out smaller than Sarah had intended, weighted with the understanding that cattle theft was a hanging offense in Colorado territory, and men who would steal livestock rarely stopped at property crime if witnesses became inconvenient. "I'm certain someone is moving cattle through here that don't belong to them," Benjamin replied carefully. "Whether they're yours or someone else's, and whether they're being stolen or just driven across your land without permission, those are questions that need answers." The distinction was important, she realized, the difference between careless trespass and deliberate theft carrying implications that could escalate from financial loss to mortal danger. They continued their survey through the morning, documenting damage and identifying priority repairs with the systematic thoroughness of a military reconnaissance. Benjamin's knowledge of ranch operations became increasingly apparent as they worked, his suggestions revealing familiarity with everything from grass management to predator control that went far beyond what she would have expected from someone available for purchase at a dead auction. "You've managed cattle operations before," she observed as they paused to rest the horses beside a creek that marked the eastern boundary of her property. It wasn't quite a question, but it carried enough inquiry that he could choose to respond, or deflect as he preferred. "I have," he admitted, settling onto a fallen log with the easy grace of someone comfortable in outdoor spaces. "Worked for several spreads in Kansas and Nebraska before coming to Colorado. Learned early that understanding the land is just as important as understanding the animals." There was something in his tone that suggested those experiences hadn't all been pleasant, but he offered no details about what had brought him west or why he had ended up in circumstances that led to a dead auction. Sarah found herself wanting to ask more questions, to understand the story that had shaped this man who seemed so competent and self-possessed despite his current reduced circumstances. But she had learned the hard way that some subjects required careful approach, that grief and loss created territories that couldn't be entered without invitation. Instead, she found herself talking about Michael, sharing memories that she hadn't spoken aloud since his funeral. She told Benjamin about her husband's dream of building the finest cattle operation in the Arkansas River Valley, his plans for breeding programs and land acquisition that would have made Riverside Ranch a name known throughout Colorado territory. The words came easier than she had expected, as if Benjamin's quiet attention had created a space where those memories could be safely examined. "He sounds like a man with vision," Benjamin said when she finished describing Michael's elaborate plans for expansion and improvement. "Those kinds of dreamers are rare and valuable, even when their dreams outpace their resources." There was something in his voice that suggested personal experience with such dreamers, perhaps admiration mixed with the kind of protective instinct that practical people develop toward those whose hearts consistently overrule their heads. "Sometimes, I wonder if I'm doing him a disservice by trying to keep this place running," Sarah admitted, the confession emerging from a place she hadn't known was so close to the surface. Maybe his dreams were too big for someone like me to manage. Maybe I should sell what's left and start over somewhere simpler. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment. His attention focused on the creek water that moved around stones worn smooth by countless seasons of flow and change. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had wrestled with similar questions about duty and capability and the responsibility that comes with carrying forward another person's vision. I knew a man once who built something beautiful, something that mattered, he said slowly, as if choosing each word with deliberate care. When he died, the people who loved him had to decide whether to preserve what he had created or to let it fade away naturally. They chose to fight for it, not because they thought they could do it exactly the way he would have, but because they understood that love sometimes means refusing to let go, even when letting go would be easier. The story felt pointed as if it carried specific relevance to her situation, but Sarah couldn't determine whether Benjamin was speaking from personal experience or offering a parable designed to address her doubts. Either way, his words touched something in her that had been wavering between determination and despair for too many months. The people in this story, she said carefully, did they succeed in preserving what he built? The question felt loaded, with implications about her own chances of success, about whether love and determination could substitute for the resources and expertise that seemed increasingly necessary. "They're still fighting," Benjamin replied, and there was something in his voice that made her think he wasn't speaking hypothetically at all. "Some days they make progress, some days they lose ground, but they keep fighting because the alternative is unacceptable." He turned to look at her directly, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones that matter to only a few people, the ones that won't make headlines but change everything for the people involved. The afternoon was spent on practical repairs, mending fence and clearing debris with the kind of focused labor that left little room for conversation but created its own form of communication through shared effort and mutual competence. Benjamin worked with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that ranch work was a marathon rather than a sprint, pacing himself for sustainability while maintaining the kind of quality that would prevent future problems. Sarah found herself falling into sync with his work style, anticipating his needs for tools and materials in ways that surprised them both. There was something deeply satisfying about working alongside someone who shared her understanding of the relationship between immediate effort and long-term success, someone who didn't need constant explanation of why certain details mattered. By the time they returned to the main house, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, and Sarah felt the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from productive physical labor. But underneath the fatigue was something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense that progress was possible, that the overwhelming list of necessary repairs might actually be manageable with the right help and approach. "Tomorrow we should address the north boundary," Benjamin said as they unsaddled the horses and settled them for the evening. "If someone is moving cattle through your land, they're probably using established routes that we can identify and block." The suggestion was offered in the same matter-of-fact tone he had used all day, but Sarah caught the underlying implication that he was thinking beyond immediate repairs toward longer-term security. "Mr. Hayes," she said as they walked toward the house through the gathering dusk, "I want you to know that today has been the most hopeful I've felt about this place since Michael died. I know $4 doesn't buy unlimited labor, but if you're willing to stay beyond whatever period that payment covers, I'll find ways to make it worth your while." Benjamin stopped walking and turned to face her, and in the fading light, she could see something complex moving across his features. Emotions too layered to interpret, but profound enough to suggest that her offer had touched something deeper than simple employment concerns. "Mrs. Coleman," he said finally, his voice carrying a formality that hadn't been present during their working day, "I think you'll find that some debts can't be measured in dollars, and some obligations go deeper than wage labor." The statement felt weighted with meaning that she couldn't decipher, but before she could ask for clarification, he was touching his hat brim in the gesture that seemed to be his standard farewell and heading toward the bunkhouse. As Sarah prepared dinner and tried to process the events of a day that had shifted something fundamental in her understanding of what might be possible for Riverside Ranch, she found herself returning to Benjamin's words about debts that couldn't be measured in dollars. There had been something almost personal in the way he spoke about obligations, as if he understood the weight of promises made to people who were no longer alive to release you from them. The sound of his movement in the bunkhouse, visible through her kitchen window as warm lamplight, created a sense of occupancy that the ranch hadn't possessed since Michael's death. For the first time in 2 years, Riverside Ranch felt like a home rather than a monument to interrupted dreams, and Sarah allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to build something sustainable with a partner who understood both the work required and the vision that made the work worthwhile. As nights settled over the valley and the sound of the river provided its constant, comforting presence, Sarah Coleman found herself thinking that perhaps $4 had indeed purchased something valuable beyond simple labor. Perhaps it had bought her the beginning of hope and the chance to discover what kind of future could be built from the foundation of shared understanding and mutual respect. The morning would bring new challenges, as it always did, but tonight, the challenges felt manageable rather than overwhelming, the kind of problems that could be solved by people willing to work together toward common goals. And for a woman who had spent too many nights lying awake under the weight of impossible responsibilities, that shift in perspective felt like the most precious gift she could have received. 3 weeks had passed since Benjamin Hayes arrived at Riverside Ranch, and the transformation was nothing short of remarkable. The sagging fence lines now stood straight and true. The barn roof no longer leaked during the afternoon thunderstorms that rolled down from the mountains, and the cattle had stopped disappearing with the mysterious regularity that had plagued Sarah for months. More than the physical improvements, though, was the change in atmosphere that seemed to permeate every corner of the property. Sarah found herself rising each morning with an anticipation she hadn't felt since the early days of her marriage, when every sunrise brought new possibilities and every challenge seemed surmountable through shared effort and determination. Benjamin was always already at work when she emerged from the house, moving through his tasks with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that steady progress mattered more than dramatic gestures. But it was the small things that truly captured her attention, the ways he seemed to anticipate needs she hadn't even recognized herself. The horses were always fed and watered before she thought to check on them. Broken tools appeared mysteriously repaired in the workshop. The woodpile beside the kitchen door never seemed to diminish, no matter how much she used for cooking and heating water. "You're spoiling me," she said one morning as she discovered that he had not only milked her temperamental cow, but had also repaired the loose board in the chicken coop that had been allowing predators access to her flock. "I'm going to forget how to do these things myself if you keep anticipating everything I need." Benjamin looked up from the harness he was mending, and she caught something in his expression that seemed almost guilty, as if her gratitude made him uncomfortable rather than pleased. "Just trying to earn my keep," he said, but there was something in his tone that suggested his motivations went deeper than simple employment obligations. "You've earned your keep 10 times over," Sarah replied, settling onto the bench beside him to watch him work. His hands moved with the kind of unconscious skill that spoke of years spent maintaining equipment that lives depended on, each stitch placed with precision that would ensure the repair outlasted the original construction. "I'm starting to think $4 was the best investment I've ever made." The comment seemed to affect him more than she had expected, and she noticed the way his hands stilled momentarily before resuming their steady rhythm. "Mrs. Coleman," he said carefully, not looking up from his work, "there's something you should know about why I was at that auction." The words carried weight that made her stomach tighten with sudden apprehension. "What do you mean?" she asked, though part of her wasn't certain she wanted to hear the answer. The past 3 weeks had been the most peaceful and productive period she had experienced since Michael's death, and she found herself reluctant to examine too closely the circumstances that had made such peace possible. Benjamin set down the harness and turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious in a way that reminded her of the moment at the auction when she had first seen past his imposing physical presence to the man underneath. "The debts that put me up for sale," he said slowly, "they weren't mine. I was there voluntarily, working off obligations for someone else." The revelation hit her like cold water, recontextualizing everything she thought she understood about his circumstances and motivations. "Someone else? Who would you take on? Debt for that was large enough to require selling your labor?" The questions tumbled out before she could arrange them into a more diplomatic inquiry. "A friend," Benjamin replied, and there was something in the way he said the word that suggested it carried more weight than casual friendship. Someone who got in over his head with gambling debts and didn't have any other way to satisfy the creditors before they decided to take payment in blood instead of money. The explanation was offered in the flat tone of someone reciting facts, but Sarah caught the underlying emotion that suggested this friend's welfare mattered deeply to him. "That's incredibly generous," she said, trying to process the implications of his revelation, "but also incredibly risky. Debt labor contracts can be sold and transferred. You could have ended up working for someone who had no interest in treating you fairly." The practical concerns seemed obvious to her, but she realized that someone willing to sacrifice his freedom for a friend's debts might not be motivated primarily by practical considerations. "I was willing to take that risk," Benjamin said, simply, and something in his voice suggested that the friend in question had been worth any sacrifice he might have been called upon to make. "As it turned out, I was fortunate in my purchaser." The comment was accompanied by a look that made her heart skip in ways she wasn't quite ready to examine. "This friend," Sarah said carefully, "is he safe now? Are his debts satisfied?" The questions felt important, not just for understanding Benjamin's situation, but for determining whether his current circumstances were temporary or might have some permanence. "He's safe," Benjamin confirmed, but there was something in his expression that suggested the situation was more complicated than simple debt resolution. "The obligations have been met, but there are other considerations that make it difficult for him to reclaim his previous life." The careful phrasing suggested layers of complexity that he wasn't ready to share, and Sarah found herself respecting his discretion even as her curiosity was piqued. "Other considerations?" she prompted, gently, hoping he might choose to elaborate, but prepared to accept his silence if the subject was too sensitive for discussion. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on a hawk circling high above the north pasture, but Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone sharing a burden he had carried alone for too long. "My friend made some poor choices, got involved with people who don't forgive debts or forget faces," he said slowly. "Even with the financial obligations settled, there are those who would consider his continued existence an insult to their authority. So he's had to become someone else, at least for a while, until the people with long memories find other targets for their attention." The explanation painted a picture of danger and complexity that went far beyond simple gambling debts, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "These people," she said, "would they extend their anger to anyone associated with your friend? Anyone who helped him or worked off his debts?" "Probably not," Benjamin replied, but the slight hesitation before his answer suggested he wasn't entirely certain. "They got their money, and I'm just hired labor as far as they're concerned. But it's possible they might wonder why someone would take on another man's debts, might ask questions about the nature of our relationship." The implications were beginning to coalesce into a picture that made Sarah's pulse quicken with something between excitement and alarm. "Mr. Hayes," she said carefully, "are you telling me that your friend is still alive, still in hiding, and that your presence here might eventually draw unwanted attention to Riverside Ranch?" "I'm telling you that some situations are more complicated than they appear on the surface," Benjamin replied, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her feel as if he were trying to communicate something beyond his actual words. "And that sometimes the people we care about require sacrifices that go beyond what most people would consider reasonable." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, and they both turned to see Sheriff Bradley riding up the path toward the house, accompanied by a man Sarah didn't recognize. The stranger wore the kind of expensive clothes that suggested either significant wealth or the desire to project an image of success, and there was something in his bearing that made Sarah instinctively wary. "Mrs. Coleman," Sheriff Bradley called out as he dismounted, touching his hat brim with the courtesy that had marked all their interactions since Michael's death. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important. This is Mr. Fletcher from the Cattlemen's Association. He's been asking questions about cattle movement in the valley." Fletcher stepped forward with the confident smile of someone accustomed to having his presence welcomed, but Sarah noticed the way his eyes lingered on Benjamin with an assessment that seemed to go beyond casual interest. "Mrs. Coleman, pleasure to meet you. I've heard good things about Riverside Ranch from folks in town." "Mr. Fletcher," Sarah replied, rising from the bench and smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. "What can I do for you?" The formal politeness felt necessary, a barrier against whatever this visit might bring to the peaceful routine she and Benjamin had established. "We've been tracking some irregularities in cattle movement through this part of the valley," Fletcher explained, his attention dividing between Sarah and Benjamin in a way that suggested he was evaluating their relationship as much as gathering information. "Missing animals, disrupted grazing patterns, signs that someone has been moving livestock through private property without permission. I've had some cattle disappear over the past few months," Sarah admitted, seeing no reason to conceal information that was probably already known to anyone conducting a serious investigation. "But the problem seems to have resolved itself recently." She gestured toward Benjamin without thinking, acknowledging his role in securing her property. "Resolved itself?" Fletcher's attention sharpened with the intensity of someone who had detected something significant. "How do you suppose that happened?" The question was directed at Sarah, but his eyes remained fixed on Benjamin, whose expression had grown carefully neutral in the way that suggested he was choosing his responses with deliberate care. "Better fence maintenance," Benjamin said, before Sarah could respond, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone stating obvious facts. "Most cattle theft happens because it's easy, because boundaries aren't clearly marked and maintained. Make it difficult, and thieves generally find easier targets." Fletcher nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense, but Sarah caught something in his expression that suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with such a straightforward answer. "And you are?" he asked, extending his hand toward Benjamin with the aggressive friendliness of someone establishing dominance through social conventions. "Benjamin Hayes," came the reply, accompanied by a handshake that Sarah noticed lasted exactly as long as politeness required and not a moment longer. "I work for Mrs. Coleman." The introduction was technically accurate, but revealed nothing about the circumstances that had brought him to Riverside Ranch or the complexity of his relationship with his employer. "Mr. Hayes," Fletcher repeated, as if testing the name for some hidden significance. "You're not from around here originally, are you?" "I pride myself on knowing most of the ranching families in Colorado Territory, but I don't recognize the name." "Kansas originally," Benjamin replied with the same careful neutrality he had maintained throughout the conversation. "Worked my way west following the cattle markets." The explanation was plausible and unremarkable, the kind of background that described hundreds of men who had migrated to Colorado in search of opportunity and better prospects. "Kansas," Fletcher mused, and Sarah felt her anxiety spike as she recognized the calculating look that suggested he was filing away information for later consideration. "Lot of interesting developments in Kansas cattle country recently. Some big operations changing hands, some prominent ranchers having to sell out under unfortunate circumstances." The comment seemed pointed, as if Fletcher were probing for a reaction that might reveal information Benjamin wasn't volunteering freely. Sarah found herself holding her breath, aware that this conversation carried implications she didn't fully understand, but sensing that the peaceful routine of the past 3 weeks might be under threat. "I wouldn't know about that," Benjamin said with the same steady calm he had maintained throughout the exchange. "I was working smaller operations, family spreads that don't make the territorial newspapers." The response effectively deflected Fletcher's probe while maintaining the fiction of his simple hired hand status. Sheriff Bradley, who had been listening to this exchange with the patient attention of someone accustomed to letting others do the talking while he observed, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Coleman, we appreciate your cooperation. If you notice any unusual activity, cattle movement that doesn't seem to belong, strangers asking questions, that sort of thing, I'd be obliged if you'd send word to town." "Of course," Sarah replied, grateful for the sheriff's straightforward approach after Fletcher's more subtle interrogation. "Is there something specific I should be watching for?" The question was prompted by genuine curiosity and a desire to be helpful, but she also hoped it might provide some insight into what had prompted this visit. "Just the usual vigilance that good neighbors show each other," Bradley replied diplomatically. "Mrs. Coleman, you take care of yourself. Mr. Hayes, good to meet you." The farewell was accompanied by nods all around. But Sarah noticed that Fletcher's goodbye carried a weight that suggested this wouldn't be their last interaction. As the two men rode away, Sarah found herself watching their retreat with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for potential threats. Beside her, Benjamin maintained his careful stillness, but she could sense the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. That wasn't a routine visit, she said when the riders had disappeared beyond the first hill. It wasn't quite a question, but it carried enough inquiry that Benjamin could choose to respond or maintain his silence. No, he agreed, his voice carrying grim certainty. That was someone fishing for information, trying to determine if there's anything here worth closer examination. He turned to face her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her stomach clench with apprehension. "Mr. Hayes," Sarah said carefully, "I think it's time you told me the complete truth about your friend, his debts, and whatever complications might be heading toward Riverside Ranch." Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on the horizon where dust still marked the passage of their recent visitors. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone about to share secrets that might change everything between them. "My friend's name was Michael Coleman," he said quietly, and the words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "And the debts I worked off were the gambling obligations that got him killed." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Benjamin's words settled into Sarah's consciousness like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through everything she thought she understood about her husband's death. This man's presence, and the careful peace they had built together over the past 3 weeks. Michael's name hung in the air between them like an accusation, transforming what had felt like the beginning of healing into something far more complex and potentially devastating. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible, above the sound of wind moving through the cottonwoods that lined the creek. "Michael died in a mining accident. Judge Blackwood himself conducted the investigation. There were witnesses, reports, and official determination." The words came out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly enough might somehow make them more true, might restore the version of reality she had accepted and grieved over for 2 long years. Benjamin's expression carried the kind of gentle sorrow, usually reserved for delivering news of death, and Sarah realized with growing horror that he was indeed about to shatter everything she believed about the most important loss of her life. "There was an accident," he said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed events too terrible to forget. "But it wasn't random, and it wasn't caused by faulty equipment or bad luck." "What are you saying?" The question emerged as barely more than a breath, though part of her already knew that whatever answer he provided would fundamentally alter her understanding of the past 2 years and perhaps the rest of her life. "I'm saying that Michael was murdered, and that his murder was made to look like an accident to cover up the real reason he died." Benjamin's words were delivered with the flat certainty of someone reciting facts that had been burned into his memory through repetition and regret. He was killed because he couldn't pay gambling debts that had grown far beyond what anyone expected, and because the people he owed money to decided that making an example of him was more valuable than collecting what he owed. Sarah felt her legs give way beneath her, and she sank back onto the bench they had been sharing moments before, when the most complicated thing in her world had been the mystery of Benjamin's motivations for working off another man's debts. The casual normalcy of that conversation now seemed to belong to a different lifetime, a simpler world where her husband had died tragically but innocently, leaving her to grieve a loss that made sense within the boundaries of acceptable misfortune. "You knew Michael," she said, the statement emerging as she began to process the implications of Benjamin's revelation. "You weren't just working off debts for a stranger. You knew my husband personally." The words carried a weight of betrayal that surprised her with its intensity, as if his failure to reveal their connection had somehow violated the trust that had grown between them. "I knew Michael," Benjamin confirmed, and there was something in his voice that suggested their relationship had been significant enough to warrant the extraordinary sacrifice he had made. "We worked together on several ranching operations in Kansas before he came to Colorado. We were partners in more than just business." The careful phrasing seemed designed to convey importance without revealing details he wasn't ready to share. "Partners," Sarah repeated, trying to reconcile this information with the Michael she had married, the man who had spoken often of his past, but had never mentioned a partnership significant enough to inspire the kind of loyalty Benjamin had demonstrated. What kind of partners? Business partners? Friends? The questions felt inadequate to address the complexity of what she was learning, but she needed some framework for understanding the relationship that had motivated such extraordinary sacrifice. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on his hands, which were clasped so tightly that his knuckles had gone white with tension. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone revealing a truth that had shaped every decision he had made for years. Michael Coleman was my best friend, he said slowly, each word carefully chosen and deliberately placed. We grew up together in Kansas, learned ranching together, dreamed of building something permanent together. When he decided to come to Colorado and start fresh, I stayed behind to finish some obligations, planning to join him once I had settled my affairs. The explanation painted a picture of friendship and shared vision that made his current sacrifice comprehensible while raising new questions about why Michael had never mentioned such an important relationship. He never talked about you, Sarah said, the admission emerging before she could consider how it might sound or what it might reveal about her marriage. In 3 years together, he never mentioned a best friend named Benjamin Hayes, never spoke of plans for you to join him in Colorado. The statement hung between them like a challenge, demanding explanation for an omission that seemed increasingly significant. He wouldn't have, Benjamin replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested Michael's silence had been deliberate rather than oversight. By the time you married him, he was trying to become someone different, someone who could leave his past behind and build a future based on new possibilities rather than old mistakes. The explanation offered absolution for Michael's silence while hinting at complications that had made a clean break seem necessary. What kind of mistakes? Sarah asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to hear the answer. The Michael she had married had seemed refreshingly straightforward, a man whose dreams were larger than his current circumstances, but whose character seemed fundamentally solid and reliable. The suggestion that he had been running from something significant enough to require abandoning close friendships challenged everything she thought she knew about the man she had loved. The kind that follow you no matter how far you run, Benjamin said with the grim certainty of someone who had learned this lesson through personal experience. Michael had a weakness for gambling, and in Kansas that weakness got him involved with people who don't forgive debts or forget faces. Coming to Colorado was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to build something clean and honest without the complications of his past. The revelation hit Sarah like a series of physical blows, each piece of information recontextualizing memories and conversations in ways that made her question her ability to judge character and understand the people closest to her. Michael's occasional trips to town that lasted longer than expected, his periodic moodiness that she had attributed to the pressures of building a ranch, his reluctance to discuss his past in detail, all took on new significance in light of what Benjamin was telling her. The gambling continued after he came to Colorado, she said, the statement emerging as she began to fit pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized existed. Those trips to town, the times he said he was meeting with potential investors or suppliers. The pattern was becoming clear now, and with clarity came a sickness that had nothing to do with physical illness. The gambling continued, Benjamin confirmed, his voice heavy with regret that seemed personal rather than merely sympathetic. And eventually, the people he owed money to in Kansas tracked him down and demanded payment with interest that had been accumulating for years. When he couldn't pay, they decided that killing him and making it look accidental would serve as a warning to others who might think they could simply disappear rather than honor their obligations. You knew this was happening, Sarah said, the accusation emerging before she could moderate her tone or consider the fairness of blaming Benjamin for events he might not have been able to prevent. You knew he was in danger, and you let him die anyway. The words came out harsher than she had intended, driven by grief and anger that needed a target and had found one in the man who had become the center of her current world. I knew he was in trouble, Benjamin admitted, and the pain in his voice suggested that her accusation had struck something he had already used to torment himself. I knew he was gambling again, knew he was accumulating debts he couldn't pay. I tried to warn him, tried to convince him to leave Colorado and start over somewhere else. But he was determined to make Riverside Ranch work, determined to prove that he could build something permanent and valuable. "So you let him die," Sarah repeated, the words emerging with the flat certainty of someone stating an undeniable fact. "You let the best friend you supposedly cared about get murdered rather than intervening in some way that might have saved his life." The accusation was unfair and she knew it, but the emotions churning through her demanded expression, and blame felt more manageable than the complex grief that was threatening to overwhelm her. "I tried to intervene," Benjamin said quietly, and something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. Noting the way grief had carved lines around his eyes, the silence that followed Benjamin's admission stretched between them like a chasm that might never be bridged, filled with the weight of revelations that had transformed their carefully built understanding into something unrecognizable and potentially destructive. Sarah stared at this man who had become so central to her daily existence, trying to reconcile the gentle competence she had witnessed with the devastating knowledge that he had failed to save the person who mattered most to her in the world. "How did you try to intervene?" she asked finally, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone determined to understand the complete truth before deciding how to respond to it. "What exactly did you do to help Michael when you learned he was in danger?" The questions emerged with the precision of someone conducting an interrogation, and she realized that some part of her was indeed putting Benjamin on trial for sins of omission that might be unforgivable. Benjamin rose from the bench and walked to the fence line, his massive frame somehow diminished by the weight of memories he was being forced to confront. When he spoke, his voice carried the hollow quality of someone reciting events that had haunted his sleep for years. "I came to Colorado as soon as I learned that his creditors had tracked him down," he said, his attention focused on the horizon as if he could see the past playing out in the distance. "I arrived in Millbrook 2 days before the accident, carrying enough money to pay off what I thought he owed. But the debts had grown far beyond what either of us had imagined, and the people he was dealing with had decided that money alone wasn't sufficient to settle accounts." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach as she began to understand the implications of what he was telling her. "They wanted more than money," she said, the statement emerging as she processed the logic of men who used violence as a business tool. "They wanted to make an example of him. They wanted to send a message to anyone else who might think they could escape their obligations by simply moving to a new territory," Benjamin confirmed, turning back to face her with eyes that held more pain than she had ever seen in another human being. Judge Blackwood was in their pocket, along with several other officials who made sure that investigations went in directions that served their interests rather than revealing inconvenient truths. The mention of Judge Blackwood sent a shock through Sarah that was almost physical in its intensity. The man who had conducted the official investigation into Michael's death, who had assured her that everything possible had been done to determine the cause of the accident, had been working to conceal the truth rather than reveal it. The corruption implied by Benjamin's statement made her question everything she thought she knew about justice and authority in Millbrook. "Judge Blackwood knew Michael was murdered," she said, the words emerging as she struggled to process the scope of the conspiracy that had shaped her understanding of her husband's death. "He deliberately covered up evidence, filed false reports, lied to me about what really happened." The betrayal felt almost as devastating as learning the truth about Michael's gambling, another foundation stone of her world revealed to be built on deception and corruption. "Judge Blackwood arranged Michael's death," Benjamin said with the flat certainty of someone stating facts that had been verified through personal observation. "He was the one who suggested the mining accident as a way to eliminate Michael while avoiding questions that might implicate other people. He was the one who made sure the investigation found exactly what it was supposed to find and nothing more." Sarah sank back onto the bench as the full scope of what Benjamin was revealing settled into her consciousness, like poison spreading through her bloodstream. Not only had her husband been murdered, but the man responsible for investigating his death had been complicit in the crime. The official version of events that she had grieved over and accepted was not merely incomplete, but deliberately fabricated to protect the people responsible for destroying her life. "You have proof of this," she said, the statement emerging, as she realized that Benjamin's certainty suggested more than speculation or suspicion. "You witnessed these arrangements being made, or you have evidence that documents what really happened." The possibility that concrete proof existed offered hope for justice, while simultaneously raising questions about why such evidence hadn't been revealed during the investigation. "I have proof," Benjamin confirmed, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw a small leather journal that looked worn from handling and age. Michael kept detailed records of his gambling activities, including names, dates, amounts owed, and conversations with people demanding payment. He also documented threats that were made and arrangements that were discussed. The journal felt substantial in Sarah's hands when he passed it to her, weighted with significance that went far beyond its physical mass. The pages revealed Michael's careful handwriting documenting a spiral of debt and desperation that made Sarah's heart ache with sympathy for the impossible position her husband had found himself in. Entries showed initial small bets escalating into larger risks as he tried to win back previous losses, creating a cycle that led inevitably toward catastrophe. More disturbing were later entries that documented threats against not only Michael, but against Sarah herself, warnings that his failure to pay would result in consequences that extended beyond his own welfare. "They threatened me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she read her own name in Michael's familiar handwriting, surrounded by words that described violence and retribution in clinical detail. "They told him that if he didn't pay, they would hurt me as well." The knowledge that she had been targeted by people capable of murder made her feel exposed and vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with her current circumstances. "That's when I arrived," Benjamin said, settling back onto the bench beside her with the careful movements of someone who understood that proximity might not be welcome given what he was revealing. "Michael called me when the threats became specific, when it became clear that running away hadn't solved his problems and might have made them worse." The admission painted a picture of friendship and loyalty that made his current presence at Riverside Ranch comprehensible while raising new questions about his failure to prevent the tragedy that followed. "What happened when you arrived?" Sarah asked, turning pages that documented increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate with people who had apparently moved beyond the possibility of reasonable settlement. "Did you meet with these creditors? Did you try to pay them off or convince them to accept alternative arrangements?" The questions emerged as she tried to understand the sequence of events that had led to Michael's death despite Benjamin's intervention. "I met with them," Benjamin confirmed, and something in his voice suggested that those meetings had not gone as he had hoped. "I offered to pay double what Michael owed if they would leave both of you alone and consider the debt settled." But they had moved beyond simple financial considerations. They wanted to establish their reputation as people who couldn't be cheated or avoided, and Michael's death was going to serve that purpose regardless of what anyone else was willing to pay. The casual ruthlessness implied by Benjamin's account made Sarah feel sick with rage and helplessness. Michael had died not because his debts couldn't be paid, but because his death served the business interests of people who used murder as a marketing tool. The senselessness of it was almost harder to bear than the original grief of losing him to what she had believed was simply bad luck and dangerous work. "So you watched them kill him," she said, the accusation emerging before she could consider whether it was fair or productive. "You knew it was going to happen, and you let it proceed anyway." The words came out harsh and unforgiving, driven by emotions that demanded someone be held accountable for the loss that had defined her life for the past 2 years. "I tried to stop it," Benjamin replied, and for the first time since he had begun his revelations, his voice carried an edge of anger that matched her own. "I was there when they sabotaged the equipment that caused the cave-in. I fought 3 men to try to reach Michael before the roof collapsed. I failed, but not because I didn't try." The rawness in his voice suggested that her accusation had touched a wound that remained painfully fresh despite the passage of time. Sarah looked at him more carefully and noticed for the first time the small scars on his hands and arms that she had attributed to routine ranch work, understanding now that they represented evidence of a desperate fight to save her husband's life. The realization that Benjamin had risked his own safety in an attempt to prevent Michael's death complicated her anger in ways that made her feel even more confused and overwhelmed. "You were injured trying to save him," she said, the statement emerging as she began to understand the physical cost of his failed intervention. "That's why you have those scars, why you sometimes favor your left side when you think no one is watching." The observations that had seemed merely curious when she had first noticed them now took on profound significance as evidence of sacrifice and loyalty. "I was injured trying to save him," Benjamin confirmed, unconsciously touching his left shoulder in a gesture that suggested ongoing discomfort from wounds that had apparently never healed completely. When the fight was over and Michael was dead, Judge Blackwood had me arrested for interfering with official business and creating a public disturbance. I spent 6 months in jail while they made sure their version of events became the accepted truth. The additional revelation that Benjamin had been punished for trying to save Michael's life added another layer of injustice to a situation that already seemed beyond the bounds of acceptable behavior in a civilized society. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of corruption and violence that had shaped events she had believed she understood, realizing that virtually everything she had accepted about Michael's death was not merely wrong, but deliberately fabricated. The gambling debts that put you up for auction, she said as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Those were Michael's debts, weren't they? The same debts that got him killed. The connection seemed obvious now that she understood the relationship between the two men, but the implications raised new questions about Benjamin's motivations and long-term plans. Those were Michael's debts, Benjamin confirmed. When I got out of jail, I learned that the people who killed him were still expecting payment, still threatening anyone associated with him. So I took on the obligation myself, working off what he owed to protect you from the consequences of his gambling. The explanation revealed a level of selfless dedication that made Sarah feel ashamed of the anger she had directed at him for failing to prevent Michael's death. "You've been protecting me for 2 years," she said, the realization emerging as she understood that his presence at Riverside Ranch was not coincidental, but part of a long-term effort to shield her from dangers she hadn't even known existed. "All this time, you've been working to keep me safe from people who might still consider me a target." "I've been protecting you for 2 years," Benjamin agreed, and something in his voice suggested that the obligation had become more personal over time than simple duty to a dead friend. Initially, it was just about making sure Michael's creditors understood that his debts were being satisfied and that you were not responsible for his obligations. But as I learned more about you, as I watched you fight to keep his dream alive despite impossible circumstances, it became about more than just duty. The admission hung between them like a bridge that might lead to understanding or might collapse. Under the weight of everything that had been revealed, Sarah found herself studying Benjamin's face, trying to read in his expression what role she had come to play in his motivations and whether his feelings had evolved beyond protective obligation into something more personal and complex. "More than duty," she repeated, testing the words for their implications and possibilities. "What exactly has it become, Mr. Hayes?" The question emerged with careful formality, as if using his surname might create some distance from the emotional intensity of revelations that had transformed her understanding of everything that mattered to her. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on the journal that still lay open in Sarah's lap, displaying Michael's desperate attempts to document and perhaps control circumstances that had spiraled far beyond anyone's ability to manage. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the vulnerability of someone revealing truths that made him defenseless. It became about loving the woman who had enough strength to build something beautiful with a dreamer, enough loyalty to fight for his memory even when fighting seemed hopeless, and enough grace to show kindness to a stranger who appeared at her lowest moment, he said quietly. It became about wondering what might be possible if someone like that could learn to trust someone like me with more than just ranch work and cattle repairs. The confession settled into Sarah's consciousness, like seed planted in fertile soil, carrying possibilities that both terrified and attracted her in ways she wasn't prepared to examine. The man who had become so essential to her daily existence was revealing feelings that went far beyond employment or even friendship, suggesting a future that could be built on foundations more complex and potentially more rewarding than simple gratitude for services rendered. "Someone like you," she said carefully, unsure whether she was ready to explore the implications of his statement, but unable to let it pass without some response. "You mean someone who failed to save the person who mattered most to me? Someone who let my husband die and then showed up 2 years later to work off his own guilt by fixing my fences?" The harsh words emerged before she could moderate their impact, driven by emotions that she couldn't fully understand or control. Benjamin absorbed them with the stoic acceptance of someone who had already condemned himself more thoroughly than anyone else could, but she could see the way they affected him, adding weight to burdens he was already carrying. I mean someone who would spend the rest of his life trying to build something worthy of the trust you've shown me, he replied quietly. Someone who understands that some mistakes can never be completely forgiven, but who believes that the attempt to earn forgiveness through action and dedication is worth making anyway. The simple honesty of his response cut through Sarah's anger in ways that left her feeling exposed and uncertain. This man had revealed truths that fundamentally altered her understanding of the past, while offering possibilities for the future that challenged everything she thought she wanted from the remainder of her life. The choice of how to respond felt overwhelming in its significance and consequences. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the yard and the normal sounds of ranch life continued around them, Sarah Coleman found herself facing decisions that would determine not only her own future, but the fate of the man who had sacrificed years of his life to protect her from dangers she had never known existed. The revelation that Michael's death had been murder rather than accident demanded justice, but pursuing justice might require exposing herself to the same people who had killed her husband. The knowledge that Benjamin's feelings had evolved beyond duty into love offered possibilities for healing and partnership. But accepting those possibilities meant forgiving him for failures that had cost Michael his life. The weight of choice, pressed down on her like a physical burden, made heavier by the understanding that whatever she decided would echo through the remainder of both their lives. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, promising rain that the valley needed but might not be ready to receive. Sarah found herself thinking that the approaching weather seemed an appropriate metaphor for the emotional turbulence that threatened to reshape everything she thought she knew about love, loss, loyalty, and the complicated mathematics of human obligation. The storm that had been gathering over the mountains arrived with the sudden violence that characterized Colorado weather, transforming the peaceful afternoon into a maelstrom of wind and rain that seemed to mirror the emotional turbulence churning through Sarah's heart. She and Benjamin took shelter in the barn, standing among the familiar smells of hay and leather while lightning illuminated the valley in stark, dramatic flashes that revealed the landscape in moments of brilliant clarity, before plunging it back into shadow. "There's something else you need to know," Benjamin said as thunder rolled across the hills like the sound of distant artillery, his voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "Something about why I really came to Riverside Ranch. Why I allowed myself to be purchased at that auction." The admission carried weight that suggested another revelation, another truth that would further complicate the already complex tapestry of secrets and motivations that had brought them to this moment. Sarah turned to face him fully, bracing herself for whatever additional shock he might deliver, wondering if her capacity for surprise and emotional upheaval had reached its limits or if there were still depths of complexity she hadn't yet imagined. "What else?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos of feelings that Benjamin's previous revelations had unleashed. "I didn't just take on Michael's debts to protect you from his creditors," Benjamin said slowly, his words chosen with the care of someone navigating dangerous emotional territory. "I came to Riverside Ranch because I needed to understand what kind of woman could inspire the devotion Michael felt for you. What kind of person was worth the sacrifices he was willing to make." The explanation suggested that Benjamin's interest in her had predated their meeting, that his decision to work off Michael's obligations had been motivated by curiosity about her character as much as loyalty to his dead friend. "You wanted to evaluate me," Sarah said, processing the implications of his statement with growing understanding. "You wanted to see if I was worthy of the love Michael felt for me, if I deserved the sacrifices you were making on his behalf." The realization that she had been under observation without knowing it felt invasive, as if her private grief and struggles had been subject to judgment by someone whose opinion she had never sought. "I wanted to understand what Michael saw in you," Benjamin corrected gently, his tone suggesting that her interpretation, while not entirely wrong, missed important nuances. "Michael talked about you constantly in his letters, described your strength and kindness and determination in ways that made you seem almost mythical. I needed to know if the woman he described actually existed, or if grief and distance had transformed his memories into something idealized and unrealistic." The mention of letters surprised Sarah, since she had never seen correspondence from Benjamin among Michael's possessions. But she realized that Michael had been secretive about many aspects of his past, and destroying evidence of continuing connections would have been consistent with his apparent desire to start fresh in Colorado. "What did he tell you about me?" she asked, curious despite herself about how Michael had portrayed their marriage to his closest friend. "He told me that you were the strongest person he had ever met, that you could accomplish more with determination and careful planning than most people could achieve with twice the resources," Benjamin replied, his voice carrying the warmth of someone recounting treasured memories. "He said that you understood him in ways that made him want to become worthy of your faith in him, that being married to you made him believe he could build something permanent and meaningful." The description of Michael's feelings for her brought tears to Sarah's eyes, not just because it revealed the depth of his love, but because it suggested that his gambling and the problems it created had been motivated by desire to succeed rather than simple recklessness. Understanding that his destructive choices had grown from positive intentions didn't excuse them, but it added layers of tragedy to his death that made her grief more complex and somehow more manageable. "He never told me about the gambling," she said quietly, wiping rain from her face with hands that trembled slightly from emotion rather than cold. "In 3 years of marriage, he never gave me any indication that he was risking our future on cards and dice. I thought the financial struggles were just the normal challenges of building a ranch from nothing." He was ashamed, Benjamin said, with the certainty of someone who had witnessed Michael's internal struggles firsthand. "He knew that his gambling was a betrayal of everything you were working toward together, but he couldn't stop himself from believing that the next bet would be the one that solved all your problems permanently." The explanation offered insight into Michael's psychology without excusing behavior that had ultimately cost him his life and left Sarah alone to deal with consequences she had never chosen. "The debts he accumulated," Sarah said, thinking through the practical implications of what Benjamin had revealed. "How much did they total? How much have you been working to pay off?" The question felt mercenary, but understanding the scope of Michael's obligations seemed important for grasping the magnitude of Benjamin's sacrifice. $12,000, Benjamin replied, and the sum hit Sarah like a physical blow, plus interest and penalties that brought the total to nearly $20,000 by the time I took over the responsibility. The amount represented more money than Riverside Ranch could generate in 5 good years, a debt so massive that satisfying it through labor would require decades of work at standard wages. $20,000, Sarah repeated, struggling to comprehend how anyone could accumulate such obligations through gambling or why Benjamin would voluntarily take on such crushing responsibility. At normal wages, working off that amount would take you the rest of your life. You've committed yourself to decades of servitude to pay for Michael's mistakes. I've committed myself to making sure that Michael's mistakes don't destroy the woman he loved, Benjamin corrected, and there was something in his voice that suggested his motivations had evolved beyond simple obligation into something more personal and immediate. "When I arrived at Riverside Ranch and saw what you had accomplished despite losing everything that mattered to you, when I watched you fight to preserve Michael's dreams, even when fighting seemed hopeless, I realized that protecting you had become more important to me than satisfying ancient debts." The admission hung between them like a bridge that Sarah could choose to cross or leave uncompleted, carrying implications that would determine the direction of both their lives. The storm outside seemed to be intensifying, wind driving rain against the barn walls with increasing force, but the violence of the weather felt distant compared to the emotional intensity of the conversation unfolding within their shelter. "More important," Sarah said, testing the words for their meaning and implications. "Are you saying that your feelings for me have become stronger than your loyalty to Michael's memory?" The question felt dangerous, as if asking it might commit her to responses she wasn't ready to make, but the need to understand Benjamin's true motivations had become urgent. "I'm saying that loving you has taught me the difference between honoring the dead and sacrificing the living," Benjamin replied, with quiet intensity. "Michael would want you to be happy, would want you to build a future that includes joy and partnership and the possibility of family. Spending my life working off his debts while watching you struggle alone wouldn't serve his memory or your welfare." The word love hung in the air between them like lightning waiting to strike, carrying electrical potential that could illuminate or destroy, depending on how Sarah chose to respond to it. She found herself studying Benjamin's face in the flickering light from the lantern they had brought into the barn, noting the way vulnerability had softened features that usually carried the careful control of someone who understood the weight of his own strength. "You love me," she said, speaking the words aloud to test their reality and her own response to hearing them. "Despite knowing that I was Michael's wife, despite understanding that I might never be able to separate my feelings for you from my grief for him, you've allowed yourself to love me. I love you despite knowing that my feelings might not be returned, despite understanding that asking you to trust me with your future requires forgiving me for failing to save your husband." Benjamin replied with the honesty of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I love you because of your strength and kindness and the way you've refused to let tragedy defeat you. I love you because being near you makes me want to become someone worthy of the faith you've shown in me." The simple sincerity of his declaration cut through Sarah's defenses in ways that left her feeling exposed and uncertain, but also strangely hopeful. This man who had sacrificed years of his life to protect her from dangers she hadn't known existed was offering her not just love, but partnership in building something that could honor the past while embracing the future. "Benjamin," she said, using his first name deliberately for the first time since learning his true identity, "I need you to understand something about my feelings, about what these revelations have done to my understanding of everything that's happened." The words felt inadequate to address the complexity of emotions churning through her, but she needed to be honest about her internal struggles before making any commitments about their shared future. "I'm listening," he said simply, his attention focused on her with the intensity of someone whose entire future hung in the balance of what she might say next. Learning that Michael was murdered, that his death was preventable, that the people responsible are still alive and unpunished, makes me angry in ways I didn't know were possible, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she gave voice to feelings she was still discovering. "But learning that you've spent 2 years protecting me from consequences I never knew existed, that you've sacrificed your freedom and future to honor obligations that weren't even your own, makes me feel something I thought I would never experience. Again, what does it make you feel?" Benjamin asked gently when she paused, as if afraid that pushing too hard for answers might cause her to retreat from whatever conclusion she was approaching. "It makes me feel like maybe the part of my heart that died with Michael could learn to live again," Sarah admitted, the words emerging with surprising certainty despite the emotional chaos of the day. "It makes me think that perhaps the best way to honor his memory is to build something beautiful with someone who understands the value of what we lost." The confession seemed to affect Benjamin more powerfully than anything else that had passed between them, and she could see the way hope and disbelief warred across his features as he processed what she was telling him. "Sarah," he said, and the way he spoke her name carried reverence that made her heart skip with possibilities she had thought were forever lost to her. "I'm not saying it will be simple," she continued, needing him to understand the complexity of what she was feeling, before he interpreted her words as promises she might not be able to keep. "Loving someone who was connected to Michael's death, even someone who tried to prevent it, is going to require forgiveness I'm not sure I'm capable of. And building a future together means dealing with people who are still dangerous, still capable of destroying what we might try to create." "I understand," Benjamin said, moving closer to her with the careful movements of someone approaching something precious and potentially fragile. "I understand that forgiveness is something that has to be earned rather than demanded, and that building trust requires time and proof of worthiness. I'm willing to spend whatever time is necessary to demonstrate that my feelings for you are genuine and lasting." "The people who killed Michael," Sarah said, thinking through the practical implications of what a future with Benjamin might require. "They're not going to simply disappear because we've decided to build something together. Judge Blackwood and his associates still represent threats to anyone who might challenge their version of events or seek justice for what they've done." "They represent threats," Benjamin agreed, "but they're not invincible. Michael's journal contains evidence that could expose their corruption and potentially bring them to justice. And there are federal authorities who would be very interested in learning about territorial officials who take money to cover up murders and protect criminal enterprises. The possibility of justice for Michael's death added another dimension to Sarah's decision-making process, suggesting that choosing a future with Benjamin might also mean choosing to fight for truth and accountability rather than simply accepting the official lies that had shaped her understanding for 2 years. The prospect of challenging powerful, corrupt men felt terrifying, but the alternative of allowing them to escape consequences for their crimes felt even worse. If we pursue justice for Michael, she said, thinking through the risks and implications, we'll be putting ourselves in direct conflict with people who have already demonstrated their willingness to use murder as a business tool. They won't hesitate to eliminate us if they decide we represent threats to their security. That's true, Benjamin acknowledged, but we'll also be exposing them to scrutiny that could end their ability to operate with impunity. Sometimes the best protection against dangerous people is making sure their crimes become public knowledge that can't be covered up or ignored. The storm outside was beginning to subside, thunder growing more distant and rain settling into the steady rhythm that suggested lasting precipitation rather than violent tempest. Sarah found herself thinking that the changing weather seemed symbolic of her own emotional state, the initial shock and turbulence of Benjamin's revelations giving way to something more stable and potentially nourishing. "I want justice for Michael," she said finally, the words emerging with firm certainty that surprised her with its strength. "I want the people who killed him to face consequences for their crimes, and I want the truth about his death to replace the lies that have been accepted as fact. And I want to build that justice alongside someone who loved him enough to sacrifice everything for his memory." Benjamin's response was immediate and wordless, his arms coming around her with the careful strength of someone who understood the preciousness of what he was being offered. Sarah allowed herself to lean into his embrace, feeling for the first time in 2 years that she was not facing the future alone, that someone who understood the weight of her losses was willing to help carry the burden of whatever came next. "My heart died with my wife," Benjamin whispered against her hair, his voice thick with emotion that spoke to years of loneliness and sacrifice finally finding resolution. "But you've taught me that death doesn't have to be permanent, that hearts can be reborn when they find someone worth living for." The words settled into Sarah's consciousness like seeds finding fertile ground, carrying the promise of growth and renewal that she had thought was forever lost to her. As she stood in Benjamin's arms while rain continued to fall on the valley that had become their shared home, Sarah Coleman understood that some endings were actually beginnings, that some losses created space for different kinds of love to take root and flourish. The choice she was making would require courage, forgiveness, and the willingness to fight battles that might cost them everything they hoped to build together. But looking into Benjamin's storm-gray eyes, seeing the devotion and determination that had motivated 2 years of selfless sacrifice, Sarah knew that some risks were worth taking when the alternative was a lifetime of wondering what might have been possible. Michael's memory would always be part of whatever future she and Benjamin built together, not as a ghost that haunted their happiness, but as a foundation that had taught them both the value of love worth fighting for, the justice they would seek. For his death would honor his life while clearing the way for their own future, and the ranch they would build together would stand as testament to the power of dreams that survive even when dreamers don't. As evening settled over Riverside Ranch and the storm moved on toward the eastern plains, Sarah Coleman and Benjamin Hayes began planning a future that would require everything they had learned about love, loss, loyalty, and the complicated mathematics of human obligation. The road ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but they would travel it together, carrying the strength that comes from understanding that some bonds transcend death and some love stories are worth any sacrifice required to write them. 6 months after the storm that had changed everything between them, Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching Benjamin work with the new foal that had been born to their prize mare just 3 days earlier. The sight of his massive hands, gentle as whispers as he encouraged the young animal to trust human touch, never failed to make her heart flutter with the same intensity she had felt during those first confusing weeks when she hadn't understood the depth of connection that already existed between them. The federal investigation into Judge Blackwood's corruption had concluded the previous month with arrests that sent shockwaves through Colorado Territory's political establishment. Michael's journal, combined with testimony from witnesses who had finally felt safe enough to come forward, had exposed a network of bribery and murder that reached far beyond Millbrook's boundaries. Blackwood himself was awaiting trial in Denver, his reputation destroyed and his political career reduced to ashes by revelations that painted him as a man who had sold justice to the highest bidder. More satisfying than Blackwood's downfall, though, was the transformation that had occurred at Riverside Ranch itself. The cattle operation that had been hemorrhaging money and hope for 2 years was now thriving under Benjamin's experienced management and Sarah's careful attention to financial details. They had expanded the herd, improved the breeding stock, and established contracts with buyers who valued the quality of animals that careful husbandry could produce. The partnership that had begun with $4 at a dead auction had evolved into something that neither of them could have imagined during those first tentative weeks of shared work and growing trust. Benjamin's expertise in range management, combined with Sarah's understanding of business operations, had created an operation that honored Michael's original vision while exceeding his most optimistic projections for success. But the success of the ranch, satisfying as it was, paled in comparison to the personal happiness that Sarah had discovered in building a life with someone who understood both her strengths and her sorrows. Benjamin's love had not replaced her memories of Michael, but had created space for different kinds of joy to coexist with grief that would always be part of her emotional landscape. The wedding had taken place just 2 weeks earlier in the little church where Michael was buried, a ceremony that acknowledged the complex emotions of building new love from the foundation of loss, while celebrating the possibility of happiness that neither Sarah nor Benjamin had expected to find. The pastor had spoken about resurrection, not just of the body, but of the heart, about how love could triumph over death by creating new life from the ashes of what had been lost. Ruth Patterson had wept openly during the ceremony, confessing afterward that she had never believed Sarah would find someone worthy of her devotion, but acknowledging that Benjamin's 2 years of selfless dedication had proved his character beyond any reasonable doubt. Even Sheriff Bradley had attended, offering his congratulations and his assurance that the federal investigation had permanently eliminated the threats that had once made their happiness seem impossible. The honeymoon, such as it was, had consisted of 3 days in Denver while Benjamin testified before the federal grand jury that was preparing cases against the remaining members of Blackwood's criminal network. Sarah had accompanied him not just for moral support, but because her own testimony about the lies she had been told regarding Michael's death was crucial to establishing the scope of the conspiracy that had shaped events for years. Returning to Riverside Ranch as husband and wife had felt like coming home in ways that surprised them both with their intensity. The house that had echoed with loneliness for so long now resonated with the comfortable sounds of shared domestic life. The kitchen where Sarah had eaten solitary meals now hosted conversations that stretched long into the evening as they planned improvements to the ranch and discussed dreams that seemed achievable rather than impossible. The physical intimacy of marriage had required patience and understanding from both of them. As Sarah worked to separate her responses to Benjamin from memories of her first husband, while Benjamin struggled with guilt about claiming happiness that Michael would never experience. But love had proved stronger than complication, and the passion that had grown between them carried its own truth that honored the past while embracing the present. Mrs. Hayes, Benjamin called from the corral, using her new name with the pride of someone who still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Come see what this little one can do already. His voice carried the excitement of someone who found genuine joy in the small miracles of ranch life. And Sarah felt her heart swell with affection for the man who had taught her that some dreams were worth the patience required to see them realized. She made her way across the yard, noting with satisfaction the improvements that their combined efforts had wrought. The fences stood straight and strong. The buildings showed fresh paint and careful maintenance, and the overall impression was of a place where people took pride in their work and found satisfaction in creating something beautiful from the raw materials of land and livestock and determination. The foal was indeed remarkable, already showing the kind of spirit and intelligence that suggested it might become one of the finest horses the ranch had ever produced. Benjamin had it moving around the small corral with the confidence of an animal that trusted the human directing its steps, and Sarah could see in both horse and trainer the kind of mutual respect that made truly successful partnerships possible. "He's going to be special," she said, settling onto the fence rail to watch the training session that was as much about building relationship as teaching specific skills. Michael always said that the best horses were the ones that chose to cooperate, rather than being forced into submission. The mention of her first husband came naturally now, without the sharp pain that had once made speaking his name feel like opening old wounds. Michael was right about a lot of things, Benjamin replied, bringing the foal to a halt and rewarding it with gentle strokes and quiet words of encouragement. He understood that building something lasting requires patience and respect for the natural qualities of what you're working with. The observation applied as much to their marriage as to horse training, and Sarah appreciated the way Benjamin consistently found ways to honor Michael's memory while building their own future. "I got a letter from the territorial prosecutor today," Sarah said, producing the correspondence from her apron pocket. "They want us to testify at Blackwood's trial next month. Apparently, our testimony was crucial to convincing some of the other witnesses to come forward with information they had been too frightened to reveal before." Benjamin nodded, his attention still focused on the foal, but his expression growing serious as he considered the implications of returning to Denver for what would likely be a highly publicized trial. "Are you prepared for that? For having our personal business discussed in open court? For having reporters ask questions about Michael's gambling and our relationship?" "I'm prepared for whatever it takes to see justice done," Sarah replied with certainty that had grown stronger over the months since they had first decided to pursue truth rather than accept comfortable lies. "Michael deserves to have the real story of his death told, and the people responsible deserve to face consequences for their crimes." The trial would indeed be difficult, requiring them to relive painful memories and expose private sorrows to public scrutiny. But the alternative of allowing murderers to escape punishment felt worse than any temporary discomfort that testifying might cause. Besides, the strength they had found in each other would sustain them through whatever challenges the legal proceedings might present. "There's something else in the letter," Sarah continued, unfolding the paper to reveal additional information that had surprised her with its implications. "The prosecutor thinks that our testimony, combined with the evidence from Michael's journal, might result in financial compensation for the losses we suffered as a result of the conspiracy. Apparently, some of the property that Blackwood acquired through his criminal activities might be seized and sold to provide restitution to his victims." The possibility of financial compensation felt less important than the promise of justice, but Sarah had to admit that additional resources would allow them to expand the ranch more quickly and perhaps help other people who had suffered losses at the hands of corrupt officials. Money couldn't bring Michael back or erase the pain his death had caused, but it could be used to build something positive from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. "Whatever compensation we might receive," Benjamin said, leading the foal back toward the stable area where its mother waited, "I think we should use it to establish some kind of fund for people who have been victimized by official corruption. Michael would approve of using money gained from his death to help others who find themselves in similar circumstances." The suggestion was so perfectly consistent with both Michael's generous nature and Benjamin's instinct for turning personal pain into broader purpose that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. This was why she had been able to love again, why building a future with Benjamin felt like honoring rather than betraying Michael's memory. Both men shared the kind of fundamental decency that made sacrificing for others feel natural rather than burdensome. "That's exactly what we should do," she agreed, watching as Benjamin settled the foal with its mother and made sure both animals had adequate food and water for the evening. "We could call it the Michael Coleman Memorial Fund for Victims of Official Corruption. It would ensure that his name is remembered for something positive rather than just as a cautionary tale about the dangers of gambling." As they walked back toward the house through the gathering dusk, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. A year ago, she had been a widow struggling to keep a failing ranch operational while grieving a husband, whose death she had believed was simply tragic bad luck. Now she was a wife again, partner in a thriving operation, and key witness in a legal proceeding that would help ensure justice for crimes she hadn't even known had been committed. The transformation seemed almost too dramatic to be believable, but the evidence surrounded her in the form of repaired buildings, healthy livestock, and most importantly, the presence of a man whose love had taught her that hearts broken by loss could indeed learn to beat with joy again. Benjamin's devotion had not erased her grief, but had given it context and purpose that made carrying it feel manageable rather than overwhelming. "I need to tell you something," Benjamin said as they paused on the porch to watch the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Something I've been thinking about since the trial date was announced, since we started talking about compensation and memorial funds and what we want our future to look like." Sarah turned to face him fully, noting the seriousness in his expression, and wondering what additional revelation might be forthcoming. Their relationship had been built on a foundation of gradually revealed truths, and she had learned to trust that whatever Benjamin might tell her would ultimately strengthen rather than threaten the bond between them. "What is it?" she asked, settling onto the porch swing that Benjamin had built during their first month of marriage, creating a space where they could sit together and watch the sun set over the valley that had become their shared domain. "I want children," Benjamin said simply, his words carrying the weight of someone revealing a dream he hadn't dared voice before. "I want to fill this house with the sounds of family, want to teach sons and daughters how to care for land and animals and each other. I want to build something that will outlast both of us, something that honors the past while creating hope for the future." The confession hit Sarah with surprising force, not because the desire was unexpected, but because hearing it spoken aloud made her realize how much she wanted the same thing. The possibility of children had seemed lost to her. After Michael's death, another dream that had died along with the man who was supposed to help her realize it. But Benjamin's love had restored her faith in the future, had made it possible to imagine creating new life rather than simply preserving what already existed. "I want children too," she admitted, surprised by how natural the words felt as she spoke them. "I want little ones running through these rooms. Want to teach them about their father and their uncle Michael. Want to show them that love can triumph over loss if people are brave enough to choose hope over fear." Benjamin's response was immediate and wordless, his arms coming around her with the strength of someone who had found everything he had ever wanted in the embrace of someone who understood both his dreams and his obligations. Sarah allowed herself to melt into his warmth, feeling the truth of their shared future settling into her bones like certainty that would sustain them through whatever challenges might lie ahead. The stars were fully visible now, scattered across the sky like promises of light that would persist through even the darkest nights. Sarah found herself thinking that their love story had followed a similar pattern, beginning in darkness and confusion, but gradually revealing illumination that made everything else make sense. "We should go inside," Benjamin murmured against her hair, his voice carrying the husky quality that suggested his thoughts had turned to the physical expression of emotions that had grown too large for words alone. "Mrs. Hayes needs to be properly welcomed home from her day of correspondence and business planning." The formal way he addressed her, combined with the intimate suggestion underlying his words, sent heat through Sarah's body that had nothing to do with the warm evening air. Even after 2 weeks of marriage, the passion between them retained the intensity of something discovered rather than merely familiar, each touch and kiss carrying the wonder of people who had found love when they had expected only duty and companionship. "Mr. Hayes," she replied with mock formality that couldn't disguise the eagerness in her voice, "I believe your suggestion has considerable merit. Perhaps we should retire for the evening and discuss our plans for the future in greater detail." The laughter that followed them into the house carried the joy of people who had learned that happiness could indeed grow from the soil of sorrow, that some endings were actually beginnings waiting for the right people to write them. As Benjamin carried Sarah across the threshold of their bedroom, both of them understood that they were not just celebrating their marriage, but affirming their faith in the possibility of dreams that seemed impossible until someone proved them achievable. The Michael Coleman Memorial Fund would indeed be established, providing assistance to other victims of official corruption while ensuring that Michael's name was remembered for generosity rather than tragedy. The ranch would continue to prosper under their combined management, becoming known throughout Colorado territory for the quality of its livestock and the integrity of its owners. Most importantly, the love that had grown between them would produce children who would carry forward the best qualities of both their father and the uncle they would never meet but would learn to honor. Years later, when those children asked about the story of how their parents met, Sarah and Benjamin would tell them about auctions and storms, about secrets and revelations, about the way love could find paths through even the most complicated circumstances when people were brave enough to trust each other with their deepest truths. They would learn that some purchases were worth far more than their original price, that some debts could only be paid through love, and that hearts that seemed permanently broken could indeed learn to beat with joy again when they found someone worth living for. The ranch that had once echoed with loneliness would ring with children's laughter. The kitchen that had hosted solitary meals would become the center of family gatherings, and the valley that had witnessed tragedy would be transformed into a place where dreams not only survived but flourished under the care of people who understood that love was indeed stronger than death, more persistent than sorrow, and more powerful than any force that sought to destroy it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.